Good evening, everybody. Let me give you a mouthful of updates that I have that have come in this afternoon. I will try to get these out tonight after service if I don't forget to go put them on the email. But Mara's friend Erla's son, Dan, I think it's Stauffer, Stauffer, might be Stauffer. He's on a ventilator with a possible stroke at Forbes. And so Mara asked that we would include him. Got an update from Gloria on Amy. Her counts were remaining low. The doctors said that they had increased her chemotherapy pill that she'd been taking, and that's probably what's causing the platelets to go so low. But they ran out of platelets to give her today. They didn't even have another set of platelets to give her. She got one, but they needed another. So I don't know what that is going to entail, but she's still spiking a fever, and they really can't track it down. So they're possibly going to be doing a CAT scan and some other scans to see if they can track down what's causing her fevers to go so high. And then Kathy Pakula is, as far as I know, still in the emergency room. Every time they get her blood pressure down, it skyrockets way back up. So they're treating her, and I'll give you information once I get it. Did they admit her? Did they admit her, or is she still in ER? Is she admitted, or is she in ER? Okay. That helps me, though. So those are a few things. My wife's a little under the weather. She's just not taking any chances, so she's home. You can pray for her. Deborah Bigley, this is Andy's mom. And the whole family's been starting to come, and Deborah's been here in her brace for probably about the past month or so. She has her knee surgery rescheduled till tomorrow. So be praying for her and the rest of the family. And then pray for Mike Arrington. He's got about, I think he said, like 6 weeks of travels. He'll be here on like Sunday mornings, and he's going to be gone. So be praying for him as he travels all over. I don't know where I know he's going to Minnesota. Yeah, I got taught how to say it, not how I'd say it. Minnesota. It's Minnesota. That's my line. I had a secretary who had family there, was from there, I can't remember now. And every time I said the word Minnesota, she said, "That's not how you say it." Yes, ma'am. Did you say it? I'll just say, and you say the word. I'll just point when I want you to say that word. Okay, so we're back in Esther chapter 4. As we continue together this evening. Again, we say it, we know it, but I don't want you to miss it, because when we're relating this story and when we talk about it, we act like it's as though God's name is almost every few verses, but it's missing from the text. So it is an interesting clue, if you want to say it a clue. It's an interesting statement as to the fact that God is at work behind the scenes, even if his name is not being mentioned. And that happens sometimes in government situations. Nobody's necessarily saying God's doing anything, but God is swaying the hearts of those who are voting, and it changes the situation. So don't miss that God is very present, but yet he's very absent, at least textually. So that tension is good for us to keep in mind as we go through. We've kind of reached that new change, as we mentioned last week. This is a kind of a change in the story where we're going to see what we all are more familiar with in the story of Esther, which is kind of the exchanges between Mordecai and Esther, Esther and the king, and then, of course, Haman, and all of that craziness that's going on there. Last time we were together, we kind of looked at the first 9 verses, and we were talking about the importance of Hathach, or if you pronounce it Hebrew, maybe Hatach. We were talking about how important his role was as a eunuch to care for Esther, but he cared enough to do what he was told to take it to Mordecai, but he also came back and relayed exactly what Mordecai told him. And so that he's kind of a primary character in those first 9 verses. There's a lot going on in there, and we kind of expounded our way through there. And I want to pick up at verse 10 tonight. And we're looking at the idea that you are here for a reason. You are where you are for a reason. And it's easy to miss that. You know, well, why am I working this job? Why have I been assigned this task at work? Why is this what I'm dealing with right now? Talking about sequentially and time-wise. And the answer, in short, is just even though you don't see it, God is at work in that situation and you're there for a reason. And it's hard because most of the time we want to struggle to get out of our situations. I don't remember exactly how this goes, but I'll do my best. So when you're going along in your journey, if your walk with Christ, God's going to put you in a fix to draw you to being close to Him. So what happens is our humanity, we try to fix the fix that God put us in so that we would turn to Him. And so He puts us in a fix that we can't fix so that we have no alternative but to turn to Him. So it's like a lot of fixes. And it's a whole lot easier to do it on the first round than over here. You know, you don't want to wait until God gets you in that ultimate fix before you. I know I've heard some of your stories and other stories down through the years of, you know, I was doing this, that, and the other, and, you know, I just didn't deal with it, or I got out of it, or it wasn't in my mind to deal with, and God just put me in, I couldn't avoid it. I had to do something with it. And that's very true. So follow along, picking up at verse 10, and we'll read down through verse 14. We'll see if we can make it all the way to the end tonight. I'm kind of hoping to, but we'll see. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. So just as a rehearsal to remind ourselves, Mordecai has mourned. Esther has gotten notice of it. Esther sends clothes out. He refuses. And there's been this little, you know, big ping pong thing going on. And so now Mordecai has commissioned Hathach with certain words. So, verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach and ordered him to reply to Mordecai. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who is not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter, so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. They related Esther's words to Mordecai, and obviously you see the plural word gets laid in there, just slides right in, and we've been talking about Hathach, and all of a sudden we have they related. So there must have been him and his bodyguards or whatever that might have gone, whatever would have indicated he would have used for any kind of royal travel. He was on official business at this point, so I don't know what all that meant in this culture, but he would not have gone alone. And then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And so as we get into here, it's a direct change from indirect speech to direct speech. We're still using the intermediaries to go and travel back and forth, but we are now it's almost like a text message, but it's being verbally lived out. You know, text message over here. Hey, this is what your text message says. Text him back. And because it's exact. It has to be exact because of the royal side of this thing. Everything had to be done exactly. So it's as if Mordecai and Esther's cause, and indeed the cause of all Jews spread throughout this region, it all boils down to almost every word that they're relating right now is crucial. Because we are not talking about you're going to be enslaved and carried off to Babylon where you're going to serve the Babylonians. No, you're going to be killed. This is a death sentence with, for the most part, no way to change it. It's also a really stark change in the characterization of Esther. She seems to, what one author said, she seems to grow up overnight. It's like, she's in the king's palace, da-da-da-da-da, and now it's like, she's growing up. There's a fearless determination and she's not afraid to give feedback. How unlike her husband, who listened to what everybody else said. She had some pretty direct statements to be carried, not what do you think I should say. So she's got a backbone. Now keep in mind that Mordecai couldn't speak directly to Esther. So you've got these messages. And I don't know, there are all kinds of stories about the scribes and message bearers of these days. But I don't know if y'all ever played that game Telephone when you were kids or youth group or something. And one person tells the next person, whispers in their ear, tells them the secret, and they tell the secret to the next person, until you get all the way down. Time it gets to the other end, we have no clue what we're talking about. I could have said the brown cow was eating green grass, and over there it's the purple penguin is smelling the roses. It just changes so drastically because our hearing is not as good when we're whispering in. Yeah. Yep.
The problem is, in our society, we're not trained to repeat the stuff and memorize it. But a lot of these cultures relied on their oral tradition. This was a big deal to get it right, and they knew what they were doing. So
exactly. It's exactly. We have to get out of our mindset, get into their mindset. How did they do it? I think, as Amanda said, part of it was just that was the way they did things. If you go back even to Appalachian America and you get up in there, all of their histories are by memory. They've just shared them either in a song or oral traditions. It's still done in places around the world. I know I talk about Haiti a lot. That's just the country I've been in and out of so much. But in Haiti, they don't have Sunday school books for kids and things like that. The teacher makes the statement, the kids repeat it back. The teacher makes the next statement. And they memorize verses that way. They learn everything that way. That's how their education system works. Teacher says it, they repeat it back. And so it's not that it's not done anymore, but we are way away from. I can always remember I had one of my teachers in high school said, listen carefully to everything that's said because it matters. And I thought, yeah, whatever, you're in high school and you're like, this doesn't matter. Then I got in college and realized that I really did to listen to everything that the professor said because he might throw something in there that would give me a hint on what I needed to study. And you become more, but as a culture, we are not attentive listeners. Let's face it, how many of us have talked to somebody while we have our phone in our hands looking at something? We're watching a TV show and having a conversation. We go to the movie theaters and somebody's talking because they're still carrying on. We are not accustomed to paying good attention to each other. Every word matters in this culture. Every word matters. It would have been recorded in multiple places, multiple scribes, not necessarily this dialogue, but as anything that was official, it was highly recorded. And the hard part about that is, and I tell people this all the time, when you get a text from somebody and it ticks you off, chill out. It's words on a page. That's all it is. You can't read the emotion of somebody in a text message. Well, yeah, I know that's what they meant. No, you don't. It's words. That's all it is. So that part would have still been somewhat missing, even though they would have got the phraseology correct. The passion or the heart that would have been behind the message would have been somewhat askewed and maybe completely masked because they were paying so much attention to the details of the information. And I don't know about you, but I'll tell you this, and you're all going to start wearing veils. I like to look at people's faces. I want to look at eyes. I want to see how things are going. I like to go to the mall but not shop. I want people watch. I just want to see, what are they wearing? Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. You saw something interesting today, Jack? It's all right. So did my wife.
I had to ask for God's forgiveness.
That's one of the dangers of people watching, is you're going to have to put yourself in check sometimes. But it's so true. But, so many times, and I see this a lot when I'm counseling, I'm looking at your eyes. Your voice is telling me you're okay, and your eyes are telling me you're not. And you can read that, especially the closer the relationship, the better that is. The closer the connection. Your kids looks pretty good. Husbands and wives in an ideal situation know the looks that each other gives. It's that, I don't feel good, let's go. Or it's the, I'm done, get in the car now. Telling her husband, we're done at the hardware store. I want to go to Rose's or wherever else, I want to go to my store. There are a few ladies that like hardware stores, but anyway, there's no facial expressions, and I don't want you to miss the amount of burden that Hathach is bearing. He has to get this right, both ways. He's got to get what Esther said right, he's got to get what Mordecai said right, and literally an absence of a verb or the absence of certain information could change the whole message. And that's why I tell people all the time, do not take verses out of context. Don't build doctrines around one verse. And you get yourself in trouble. Read the context. Always look what's before it, what's after it. If you've got time, read the chapter before it and the chapter after it to understand what's going on in the circumstances. So we see this, I don't know, we basically have the salvation of the Jewish nation. That's what's on the line. Now, does Hathach understand that? Maybe a little bit. He understands what the ruling is. He understands, because he's gotten the other information, when Mordecai gives this money and gives him more details. Is he mad at the king at this point? Is he taking Esther's side at this point? Is he taking Mordecai's side at this point? The short answer is we don't know, but probably he was just a messenger. Because part of the job is to keep your opinions to yourself when you're in these situations, unless asked for. So these kind of verses, they make some things clear. First, Esther has enough authority to command Hathach to return to Mordecai with another message. She has some authority. Don't miss that, because sometimes we get the idea that in these patriarchal cultures where the men ruled and reigned over everything, and that's very true, but that didn't mean that Esther had no power. It didn't mean that she didn't have servants that she commanded, including male and female. So it's not that. Also, she has some authority in the king's court, but it's limited by her husband's. So it's kind of a predicament and opportunity. And when she speaks back to Mordecai, that kind of explains this precarious position that she finds herself in. So we start with this response of everybody knows. That's how Esther starts this. Mordecai, everybody knows you don't do this, and if you do, you can die. I think I mentioned last time we were here in this text that there were armed guards that would execute in the throne room if it happened. I mean, it wasn't like this little slide by day. And it must have happened pretty often, because it seems that, according to some of the cultural references we read, this language of, you don't do this or you're going to lose your head. So it must have happened to a few people along the way. A few people have already tried it, and it didn't work out so well for them. So that gives us a little bit of indication. And she's trying to plead her own case. Is this a lack of understanding of her Jewishness? Possibly. We've already talked that she's not exactly an Orthodox Jew at this point. Has she lost a passion for her nation? I don't know if I want to go that far. But the scepter thing, I don't know. Some of us watched little pieces. I didn't have the nerve to watch the whole coronation thing. Sorry, England. I watched pieces of it, and you see that part of that exchange is a scepter. There is a rod. It is usually somewhere between 2-3 feet or so. It's usually very ornate. It's usually either laid with gold or other fine metals. It's heavy, and it's not like what you saw King Charles do. Kind of touch it and hold it for a second. I mean, it had more weight to it than that, and it was the gateway. So follow the exchange here. Bob wants to come see me, the king. I've got the scepter. So I extend my scepter to whoever Bob sent the request with. I give it to my servant, and I extend the scepter out to the servant, giving him the message that he is welcome to come into the king's presence. That's how you get in. Word gets to the king through advisors or somehow through, it's got to be somebody up the food chain because he ain't rolling over for just anybody. But that's the way it's supposed to work. The king wants to see you, or you have followed the proper channels and you can get an audience with the king. If you come in unplanned, you can't just show up and say, hey, I'm here to tour the White House today. Sometimes it feels like that when I watch the news, but you don't walk into Buckingham Palace and just take yourself on your own little tour around the place. There's certain protocols. I mean, these days you don't walk into the schools without getting, all this stuff that you need to do, which I'm thankful for because of all the precarious situations our kids are in. I mean, it's even we have safety protocols around here with locking doors and checking things and trying to protect her. It's just the day and age in which we live in, but there's a certain way you do things. This is very widely known all throughout this entire area. You've got to remember that Xerxes' kinfolk above him were more ruthless yet than he. And they have conquered all of this area, and it would have been well known how things get done. So if you had I'm going to use the word little king over here, and that little king needed to talk to the big boss, he would get a messenger and see if he can get some time. He didn't drive across the land and stand outside the palace and hope he can get in. That was not, you didn't even bother, because the chances are you even got that far, you weren't wanted, you weren't going to get your request granted anyway, because it would have been perceived as pressuring the king to make a decision. So Esther says to Hathach to deliver to Mordecai, he's got but one law. There's one specific regulation on this matter. Don't think he's got one law running the whole land. On this particular scenario, he's got one law, that a person is to be put to death unless the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. I have seen pictures of this, different ones down through the years of Xerxes like holding his scepter out and the guards with their blades on top of the scepter kind of idea, that they were already ready to carry out their duties, so to speak. Now, was it that quick and that drastic? I don't know, but the bottom line is the end would have been the same. The end would be the same if she just came into his presence. She didn't have any more access to him than anybody else did. He had to want her. How do you figure that out? He's not been with me for 30 days. He's not seen me for 30 days. He's not called for me. The queen doesn't decide, hey, honey, we need to spend some time together. It doesn't work that way. If the king doesn't summon her, she doesn't come. So it's been 30 days. There's a lot of comments that have been made about why 30 days was it because to allow time for the fasting that was going on? Was it a gap in time to prepare Esther to not be so enamored with the king and emotional about the situation? She could think more logical. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time trying to tell you what might have been in 30 days. It just says it was 30 days. But this is the first time we find Esther, shall I say, daring to stand up to her adopted father. So at this point, she speaks back, if you will. Up till now, he said, don't do this, do this. She's done it, and whatever. Now he says, I want you to do this, and she's like, time out. Time out. They're going to kill me. So let's rethink this, Uncle. Let's rethink this thing here and go back over. On the surface, it kind of feels like Esther is almost painfully trying to communicate to Mordecai that she may not be the solution he thinks she is. It's not, I don't know if we want to go so far as it was just a bold rebellion. It was, there might be another way. This isn't the right way to do this. This isn't how it's done. Now, don't miss the fact, how did Esther get her position? Somebody didn't do what the king wanted the way he wanted to, and there we have Vashti. Bye-bye. And so she would expect no better treatment than what Vashti got if she would go in unannounced. She does allude to the fact that there is an exception. So she knew how it worked. There must have already been exceptions made for her to know that if the king extends his scepter, that changes the verdict. And so they go back to Mordecai, and so we get this interchange, and I don't know. One commentator said that there is the beginnings of a plan forming in Esther's mind. I don't get that anywhere in this. All I see is, at this point, now we get down to the next section, but this first section, it's kind of like, no, let's do something else. Let's try something else. But again, going back to our idea that we're here for a reason, this whole story hinges on whether or not the king is going to extend his scepter. It's very mesmerizing to think of it this way. I mentioned earlier, but like if you go back to Esther chapter 1 in verse 14, you had the list of the 7 nobles, and those rulers would have been the one that would be the ones that would have to get you permission. You used to have to like contact your congressman or something to get a ticket to the White House. I don't know if you still have to do that or something, write an office, say, I want to be in Washington, D.C. next date. Can you get me a tour or whatever? But it's that kind of idea. You've got to be in connection to these nobles. Esther is not in good favor with the nobles. She's an outsider. They're happy that the king is happy, but that's about it. And whether or not they knew she was Jewish is a huge, huge question, and I don't want to entertain. I'll entertain the debate to think about it and talk about it, but we can talk about what we know culturally of what a modern day Jew looks like, but a lot of genetics has passed since then. We could talk about clothing, but if she and Mordecai had indeed assimilated before all this happens, she would have been wearing Persian clothes. So did she have something on that made her look Jewish?
Whatever the secret here, you wouldn't say to say now the cat's kind of out of the bag here, because you've got all these people who were back with these messages. Somebody may talk and to get out at this point. Mordecai saying you've got to do this, it doesn't matter anymore. The whole thing, it feels like an absolute desperation right now. Like there is almost nothing, because Mordecai has to know that what the king signs a law, can't be changed.
Right.
So what does Mordecai actually expect here? What does he think the outcome is going to be here of Esther? And even if Esther goes through it, obviously the will of the son is not put out.
She's dead.
Esther life, it's the matter that the message never reaches the king at all.
Yeah.
It's her life one way or another.
Yeah, there's some truth to that too. It's interesting in this, there's reasons they've made like 8 movies about this story, because it's very dramatic. And there's a lot of interpretation things that you can slide here and there to get to this situation. I think it's One Night with the King, she wears a Star of David around her neck and a piece of jewelry, and that's what gives her away, so to speak. She didn't have Star of David on, trust me. I'm not even sure it was used that way during that time period, so. I'm not sure when it was started to be worn as jewelry, but probably not now. So she's facing death. If she does nothing, she's facing death. If she goes in and dies, the message is squashed, the insider information. What if you're Hatak and you find all this out? What do you do? We've left him in the background here for a minute, but what do you do? You've got insider information, big time. Do you go to the king and tell him what's going on? Do you go to one of the 7 nobles and say, hey, you need to get involved with what this Esther and Mordecai character are doing? They're cooking up something, getting in the way.
I would think she would have had a seal
Could have been.
that she put on the scroll, just like the king had his.
Could be very much. Could have been that way. Except for it's very much an oral exchange.
Well, but she's not talking to Mordecai.
No.
She's writing to him.
Right. It's messy. Because my personal opinion on that question I just alluded to is that Esther has won favor throughout the palace, including with Hathach. Her character has come through in how she relates even to them.
But the talk is no more privileged to go walk into the.
No, he wouldn't.
Because in fact, he'd be more likely to be killed than she was. So
Yeah, he would have to go to a nobleman or one of those big wigs and say, hey, I've got insider information. And the nobleman's going to say, well, give me the insider information and I'll decide whether or not we need to take it to the king. And we already know that these noble guys are jerks. And so they're already bending the will of the king. So it's there. It's hard to calculate numerically what all's going on here. There are some people that have tried to argue that the credibility of Esther is destroyed in this one verse, that something like this is ludicrous. I mean, there are plenty of records of this kind of behavior in ancient Near Eastern cultures. This is not just Persian, it is a lot of Eastern cultures. Josephus records it, Herodotus records it. It's not exact the way she puts it, but the policy itself is there. We have enough historical evidence to say, I mean, it does sound ridiculous when you read it. I mean, come on. The queen goes in to see the king and she gets killed because he didn't call for her? I mean, come on. What husband goes into his wife and loses his head because she didn't ask him to come?
yeah,
Well, at least not literally.
history's full of relative to all things, someone in power. So I mean, you never know if someone just barges in there, isn't it going to be an attack on the king?
Yeah, I mean, the policies were in place for a reason. And that's one of the reasons for sure. Sean?
Could I ask, in your research, or in your opinion or your understanding, when Esther speaks back to Mordecai, is it a reminder to him of what can happen, or is she pushing back against what he's done? I can't decide. From the tone, it almost sounds like she's just reminding him of what can happen.
Yeah, I've seen both. And I've seen both viewpoints taken. I can't tell if Esther is, as you say, she's standing up, but not so much rebelliously, but standing up to say, did you think about this? Versus, I can't do this. You're nuts. You know, which one? Either one would be plausible. The same results are there, except for it would reflect on the character of Esther a little bit if she was being more rebellious in this moment, which we've not seen from her yet in the story. We've seen a compliant and obedient child, if you will, between the relationship between Mordecai and Esther. So, yeah. We get down to the next verse. Then they related Esther's words to Mordecai, and Mordecai says back to Esther, listen, girl, don't you be thinking that just because you're in the king's palace that you're going to survive this. If you remain silent at this time, this verse we're gonna rip this verse apart in a minute. You're going to find, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you've not attained royalty for such a time as this. So Esther relays words back to Mordecai, and Mordecai is like, you're a Jew, you're going to get found out. How? We're not told. How are they going to discover that she was Jewish? Don't know for sure. At this point, it's definitely going to be questioned because there's a good deal of information that would seem to indicate that by Mordecai doing everything he's done, he's made it clear he's a Jew. So wouldn't his daughter be a Jew? Wouldn't his relation also be a Jew? And so at least there's a possibility of her being found out, for sure. And Mordecai is just saying, you're not safe. There's no guarantees for you. If you keep your mouth shut, you're not safe either. Then verse 14 is an interesting, and I'd like to get how you guys think about the beginning of verse 14. If you remain silent, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. What kind of statement is that? What is Mordecai trying to convey in this statement?
I think that he's saying God is going to protect his chosen people. We better be on the right side.
Okay.
Show the providence of God, even though God's not mentioned. But I think Mordecai is trying to tell Esther that God is in control, and if you don't do this, he's going to have it done another way.
What we know, Amanda,
You're going to say, yeah, you just that, not that there won't be any Jews that don't die, but a remnant is always safe.
always has been. What we don't know, even though they've assimilated to Persian culture, how much Jewish history and things has been related. We don't have evidence of that. Now, Mordecai, I think, very obviously demonstrates he has a knowledge of the covenants. In this verse particularly, this is knowledge of the covenants. And he's like, okay, if you don't do this, somebody else is going to take care of it. And the idea at the beginning of this verse that I jotted in my notes is, for us, is don't miss out on God's blessing when you're called. Don't tell God no when you should have said yes. And that's hard because sometimes I don't feel like it. And sometimes it's not convenient. And sometimes all these things flood our minds. But when God tells you to do something, don't miss out on the blessing. Do it. Enjoy his calling. This is kind of where I go back to this idea that you're here for a reason. This is part of that purpose and that mindset. Proverbs 21 verse 1 reminds us that the heart of the king is in the hand of the Lord. As the rivers of water, he turns them whatever way he wants. God's still in charge, even of King Xerxes, even though it looks like he's not. The other part of this is, I looked at another proverb, Proverbs chapter 24, verses 10 to 12. If you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. If you forbear to deliver those that are drawn unto death and those that are ready to be killed, if you say, we knew it not, I didn't know, I didn't ponder it, I didn't consider it. He that keeps your soul, he knows it, and he will render to every man according to his deeds. Your silence will be judged. That's the idea within this proverb. Your silence still, to not speak up, I think sometimes is almost worse than speaking up and saying the wrong thing sometimes. And largely, this is played true throughout history. You just want to go back to Nazi Germany and look at Bonhoeffer's blazing condemnation of the church in Germany during this time. It wasn't because they were doing wrong things. It wasn't because they were lying. It was because they kept their mouth shut. They didn't say anything. And if we want to be honest, it's the story of how abortion took its rise in America too. Those who were in Christ didn't stand up enough. Those of us who were in the church didn't make our voice heard the way we should have. And I still think we need to do that. I think that's why it's important for every believer. Romans 13, we're supposed to be involved in the government. We're supposed to be plugged in. You don't have to, God calls you into the government. I'll anoint you, but it'll look like a bucket. Because I'm not going to send you off into that without a lot of help. But for the most part, we're mostly going to be called to use our influence with our votes, to use our influence with our voice. When you have an opportunity to send a note or send an email, it's really easy. If you're not part of Pennsylvania Family Association or American Family Association, those two, they're the same organization. One's local, one's national. They'll keep you up to speed with what's going on, what votes are coming up, and they have email formats, and you can get your voice to be heard. And you say, well, does it make any difference? I don't know, but I'm not going to sit here and be silent on something that I have an avenue to speak up, so I'm going to try it. Who knew that Budweiser was going to get yunked down by a bunch of conservative beer drinkers? I mean, who knew? Who knew? But with the power of the purse, their stocks are in the tank. Target stocks are in the tank. And so Ben & Jerry's next. Ben & Jerry's next. I don't know if you read the stuff that came from the tribe, the chief, to let him know that they were ready to take over the factory and they could move out within X number of days. And so, what I'm saying is we never have an excuse to wring our hands and say there's just nothing I can do. We just got to let it unfold. And look, that's the easy route. It is. It's easy to do that, but we can't do that. And more or less, that's kind of what Mordecai is trying to say to Esther. You can't just let this go and just expect that everything's going to be okay. Mordecai's response to Esther has been used as a confession of faith. And Mordecai evidently is, I don't know, I guess what we could say, he's expecting help from somebody in the monarchy with this particular plight. Whether it be the king or one of the rulers. But at the same time, he demonstrates in his language that he believed that God in some way would protect his people. Deliverance would come, even if it had to come from another place. And that faith that seems to come out of Mordecai in this section. One author said Mordecai had a revival at some point in this thing. He had a Jewish revival to his Jewishness when all this stuff started, and he went back through, to his roots and his heritage and what he'd been taught and what he had learned of the Torah, and he was like, okay, I've messed around way too long. I got to do something. And it's very possible because he is now speaking a lot about Jewishness when before he was like, don't say anything. So he's obviously, I think, aware of the Abrahamic covenant specifically. The Davidic and the covenants of Moses would also fit there. I think at the end of the day, Mordecai is hoping, if I could use that word loosely, that God would work through Esther in her unique position. I think he was hoping that somehow that God had orchestrated all of this. And that comes clear in the last part of verse 14, and who knows whether or not you have attained royalty first. Maybe this was the purpose you've gone through everything you've gone through.
Mordecai be having some regrets for having Esther keeping the HA secret, because if it had been known and out there, the king probably never agreed to some what Haman's asked for.
I would imagine, that's why some people say that Mordecai had a revival, because they're not like super reliable commentaries, they're more story commentaries, but they put it in a narrative form that Mordecai did regret keeping Esther's secret, and maybe he was the one that was silent when he shouldn't have been. So now he wants to make sure Esther's not the one that's silent when she has the opportunity.
Well, it's a family, but now maybe when Esther goes to him, maybe he wants to hear from the horse's mouth. She's a horse, right?
Good old Esther, she's a good old nag.
He wants to hear what's going on.
It's hard for us to, in our informed culture, to understand that not everything made it into the palace. It's like I had the same thought first time, Jack. I had the same thing. The king has to know all this is going on. The king didn't know what food he was going to have for lunch and which side of the plate to eat off of. I mean, this is such a huge kingdom. Were there rumblings? Possibly, but if there were rumblings, these 7 leaders or elders could have been involved in squashing it too. That's part of that, Sean.
I'm just wondering if maybe, as time goes on, maybe Mordecai is starting to see what the purpose of the Lord might be. Because if you look back on your own life, I look back on my own life, when you're going through something, you don't necessarily see what the plan is. But after you go through it a while and you see things happening, you look back and you say, I can see the Lord working here. So could it be that Mordecai sees that she's been elevated to queen, and then this plot comes up? Could it be, we see it as we read the story.
Right.
He was a very astute man.
Yeah.
To me, it seems like he must have been aware of that.
Well, if we calculate again a revival moment into Mordecai's life, and I don't know if this story resonates with you, but if you've been away from the Lord, or maybe you've gotten slack in some things, and you get yourself back on track, some things make sense that you didn't understand because you weren't in the right place to understand what was going on. You couldn't see it because you weren't in good connection with the Lord. And it's the same, I think part of that's the same pattern here. I like the idea of Mordecai having a Jewish revival moment. I like the idea of him reflecting on the covenants. I like the idea that he had to wrestle with his own decisions that have led to this, but also really am impressed by the fact that he leans into the covenants, which is in essence Jewishness in its root, is an obedience to the covenants. And so when push comes to shove, that's where he ends, back in the covenants.
The Jews, though, have been living peaceably.
Yeah.
And all of this came about because of one man's pride and revenge.
Yep.
So the king, he's not looking for something to bring against the Jews.
Nope.
And, it all stems on Haman.
The problem has been, in my opinion, there's a lot of things that I have different issues with King Xerxes, but my biggest thing is he didn't think for himself. He always relied on somebody else to tell him stuff. And so Haman comes in and blah, 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 and he's like, okay, seal. What? I mean, these people haven't caused us any trouble. They're bringing goods to the land. They're bringing services to the land. They're living in amongst our cities. They're doing good.
But in that huge of a country, how can he know everything?
Well, he wouldn't have.
He has to rely on his advisors to tell him, because he can't possibly know, the president can't possibly know everything that's happening in California, or, he has to rely on people to tell him things. Just like I tell my boss.
That's why I get text messages that Kathy's in the hospital, because I don't know everything. Oh, you don't miss how vicious Haman is. Do not miss it. I mean, during the Feast of Purim, when the Jews celebrate Purim to this day, they tell this story, and every time Haman's name is said, everybody in the audience boos and hisses and throws things and kind of heckles just hearing his name, because he is, the King James just says, this vile Haman, this man, this vile person. That description is attached to him later, but he's a snake. You already see it. I mean, he was willing, I think he was willing to put up money to get this to happen. Now, he didn't have to. The king's like, keep your money. I will take care of it. But I think he was very willing to do it because of history.
The Jewish training would have been continual throughout this time, since they were living peaceably. I think that's the way the Lord has
Yeah.
preserved the nation.
And it's difficult to wrap your brain around the word remnant. But that's indeed what we're talking about. There has a faithful remnant that God has always preserved. I'm not going to calculate what that faithfulness looks like, but God has not abandoned Israel. Israel has a purpose yet. Their purification, as we mentioned this morning, will happen during the tribulation, bringing her back into status with God, still through Christ as Messiah. But that's going to happen. But in order for that to even happen, you have to have some kind of Jewishness maintained in culture somewhere. We went to a Jewish festival a few weeks ago when we were out of town, and it was a very liberal Jewish synagogue. The rabbi was a lady. So anyway, but you go through this, and they took us inside, and we're going through, and they're rehearsing. This is the Torah. This is what's in the Torah. This is how we do this. This is why we do this. This is why we do that. This is why you had to put a hat on the way in the door. This is da. So their history and their covenant relationship is rehearsed, even though it's been watered down. But yeah, it's still there. And I think when you read verse 14, the next statement is one that's very interesting to me. He says, if you don't do this, deliverance is coming from someplace else. As a nation, you and your father's house will perish. If deliverance is coming, why will she and her house perish? What's that?
She's the last one of her. Her father and mother died.
True. She's not going to be delivering Jewish babies if she has children, which we don't know of. It's interesting that Mordecai, and when you read your father's house, you can't read Mordecai's house or Mordecai's or Esther's real biological father. You can't read that way because you have to read it with the word beget. When you hear your father's house, it's all those begets that we don't like to read. That this one begat, this one begat, this one begat. It's your father, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It's the father's house. It's bigger than that. Let me see if we can wrap this chapter up. Esther tells them to go to Mordecai. Go ahead, assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, right there at the Winter Palace area, and ask them to fast for me. Tell them not to eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. That's an interesting phrase. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. And so Mordecai goes away and did just as Esther has commanded. The first part of it seems rather common Jewishness. We need to fast and pray over this issue. This is big enough. This is a big decision. This is a big thing. We need to fast and pray. So as with Esther, so it is with us. We need to spend time. Do you need to fast and pray every time you make a decision? You're going to get awful skinny if you do that. Because if you're trying to fast and pray before you decide what you're putting on in the morning and fasting and praying for what you're going to... But major decisions, setting aside nutrition for the purpose of seeking God's face. Fasting is not just skipping a meal. Okay, that's an unbiblical value of fasting. Fasting, a biblical fast implies setting something aside to seek something else. So I'm putting aside, there's the Daniel fast, so it's no meat, it's eating fruits and vegetables. Is it 40? I can't remember how many days right now. There's that fast. There's all these different fasts throughout the thing, but this is a total fast. where she said nothing to eat or drink night or day. I don't know if any of you have ever done an extended fast, but about day 2 is when you find out that you're a little bit hungry. First day, it's all fine because you're focused and you're mentally there. And even if you're doing a good job reading at meal times, reading scripture during meal times and seeking God's face, day 2, it gets a little hungry. Day 3, okay, we got to keep this up because this is important. But I think there is a splash over here. Mordecai's revival, Mordecai's passion for his people is well noted amongst those who are in Susa. And Esther's place in the palace is now well known amongst the Jews who are in Susa. And so for her to call for this fasting day and night, the interesting thing in this whole verse is that she asked her maidens to do the same thing. Not her Jewish maidens, by the way. They were servants. They could have been Jewish, but they were most likely Persians who were already in the palace attending to the rest of the harem. And she asks her maidens. This is another one of those things that leads me to believe that Esther's character has been so well noted in the palace. If Esther asks you to do something, you just do it because she's got a good heart. It's the right thing to do. Now, she could have commanded them to, too. That would have been within her authority. And then she says, after you do this, then I'm going to go into the king. And then she has to get the next line in there. Just one more time. It's not according to the law. I'm going against the law here. That's why the prayer and the fasting become so important. And Esther's resolve is pretty amazing. If you get to this point and you have her kind of, I don't know, I like drama, so I think sometimes in word pictures, I picture her kind of standing in a mirror or somewhere and kind of suiting her hair back and getting herself and looking at herself, squaring her shoulders back with resolve that says, this is what I'm going to do, and if I perish, I perish. If I lose my job, I'm going to lose my job. If I'm going to get fined because I said the wrong thing, I'm still going to say what God's told me to say. There is a resolve that seems to come over her where she squares back and is like, it's better to die than to not carry this through. It's better for me to die than not try. And it is so sobering because for me, and I don't know if you catch some of this, you can't miss God's sovereignty all through this little passage. You cannot miss what all's going on. And they are amazing. It's hard because in our circumstances, I don't know that we have these kind of resolves. If I die, I die. If I lose my job, I lose my job. Because we've not been faced with it until recently, really. Our Christian teachers who are in the public school system, I've mentioned before, I thank God and I pray for them because their job's on the line any given day. If they stand for Christ and stand for biblical values in any way, their job's on the line in this current climate which we're in. And it's important for all of us to take note of that God is up to something, and you and I being put where we're at in the circumstance, in the situation, for a reason. I've been put in this situation a couple times where I had to make that tough call where I could, some of it's not always about losing a job. It's usually one of these things, well, if this is how you're going to do this, Pastor, I'm leaving the church. That's always lovely to say to the pastor. The pastor loves to hear those things. So if you want to just build me up, just come and tell that to me someday. You get hit in the gut. You don't want to lose anybody. But there are times that you have to step back and say, if that's what you believe, and that's the way it's going to go, then I encourage you to find another place to worship that's consistent with those values, because I'm going to stick with Scripture. That resolve is the kind of resolve that we see with Esther. And sometimes sovereignty takes a big hit. I wanted to give you a quote from Sovereignty from Tozer. He compared God's sovereign purposes to an ocean liner that leaves New York City bound for Liverpool, England. The people on board the ship are free to do as they please, but they aren't free to change the course of the ship. There's a lot can happen on that ship, but the ship's going from port to port. That's just the way it's going. That's a mutiny, I guess. I suppose that would change it. But I mean, there's a lot of different things. You can eat certain foods, you can go to certain parties, you can wear certain clothes. There's a lot of flexibility while we're on the ship, and that's that free will part that we've been given. And he ends this section by saying, the mighty liner of God's sovereign design keeps its steady course over the sea of history. God moves undisturbed and unhindered toward the fulfillment of his eternal purposes, which he has purposed in Christ Jesus before the world began. And that's just so comforting to me. I don't know how that lands with you, but it's extremely comforting. And I would encourage you, fasting and praying in that climate is a very serious task. And don't approach it lightly. We have a lot of, I probably should do some teaching on fasting because we don't talk about it too much. And we don't really know what it means. And because everybody knows you got to fast after midnight because you have a blood test in the morning. Or you have to fast after midnight because you got a procedure the next. You know all that fasting, and that's all that kind of comes to our head. But it's actually it's a sobering task. And yet, in that soberness, we're not to be trying to draw attention to ourselves, but keeping the attention on God. So there's a lot going on there with that, but it's the reason I went back to the fasting is because there is a direct contrast between Xerxes and Esther. Esther calls for a feast. Esther calls for a fast. Xerxes calls for a feast. He's always after a party. And she's after the presence of God. And Mordecai went away. And it's interesting. Evidently, her words to him carried royal edict to it. He did just as Esther had commanded him. Not a suggestion, not said this is what you should do, but there's a direct command here, a direct approach to Mordecai. It's a little more forceful, but yet I think it's coming from a place of humility. I guess as we wrap this, let me just challenge you, always be a good steward of the situations God puts you in. Use it well. You know, we're entering into a different phase. I got about, 2-3 years yet of kids in the house still. But that means my world is going to change, and I'm going to be in a different phase. And how am I going to use that when it's that scenario? How am I going to use it when I'm with my grandkids? How am I going to use it when my car breaks down alongside the road and some guy pulls over to help me? These scenarios, these situations, these surprises that we end up in are God's opportunities for us to invite him into the moment and see what he can do. And sometimes it's sending you the person that can help you get the tire on or off, whatever it needs to be. Sometimes it's somebody to give you a ride when you're walking down the road. I mean, God is always, always ready to step into our situations. We just have to be ready, because if it doesn't look like what we think it should look like, we're going to get confused. Does it look like God's about to step into this situation? If you didn't know the rest of the story right here, see, we're all jilted. We know the whole story. We know how this story ends. But if this is all the information, you're at a climax right now. You're at a climax in the story. Everything's up in the air right now. Esther's going to go into the king. She might die. She might not. The Jews are fasting. The palace is doing whatever it does in normal, everyday, perhaps somewhat unaware. And yet, God is up to something pretty incredible through this whole arrangement. Literally, God will rescue his entire people group through this situation. So it's pretty amazing. So be ready for God to enter into your situation. And I'll tell you this, the more you invite him into your situations, when you're thrown into a situation, you'll seek him a little faster. So when you're readily saying, God, I'm going to go talk to Bob today, and we're going to talk about this situation. Larry, this morning, Say, I'm going to go talk to my brother today. He's asking me. Larry told me before service tonight that he asked his brother regarding his salvation. His brother says that he's saved. And so Larry was able to encourage him. If you know Christ, then this is okay. It's going to get worse, but it's going to be okay. And see, that's the idea. There's a problem. There's a scenario. There's something going on that I need to deal with. God help me do this. God help me do that. And the more we bring God into those situations, I think the easier it is for us to bring him into the surprises, because we've already created a habit and a pattern of allowing him to be part of our circumstances. God, thank you for your word. Thank you for those promises. Thank you for the illustration of the story, your providence, your sovereign care. Your signature rides all throughout these pages, though never known. Thank you for the stories we learn, both negative and positive. People who live after the world and people who live after you and pursue you. Help us, Father, to learn and to put into practice some of these things, even this week. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Have a good week, everybody. I'm thinking about it.